The hospital called 11 times. 11 times in 3 hours. And he never picked up. His wife was on that table,
You seem very
bleeding,
comfortable with the
fighting for
arrangement.
2 lives that were not yet in the
Let's
world,
just say
calling his
I
name through a
appreciate the
nurse who
finer
kept
things in
dialing
life,
and dialing
Edmund.
into the silence of a phone that was face down on a penthouse table 7 miles away. While the candles burned, while the wine was poured, while the woman across from him smiled and
According
said,
to the
"Eat your
deceased's
dinner."
last wishes,
Clara has
the
3 more
entirety of
weeks.
the
She did
estate
not
is to be
have 3 more
divided
weeks.
as follows.
She had 47 minutes. And when Clara Whitfield closed her eyes for the last time in that cold, white room, she did not close them empty-handed. She closed them knowing exactly what she had already put in motion. 6 weeks earlier, alone, without telling a single person, she had walked into a lawyer's office and built something. Not a cry for help, not a plea, a fortress, for 2 babies who had not yet arrived, for a truth that had not yet been spoken. For a moment in a courtroom weeks away, when a doctor would stand up and say 4 words that would bring everything crashing down on the woman who had laughed at her funeral, stay with me. Because what Clara left behind is not just a story about betrayal. It is a story about what a woman can build in silence when no one is watching, and it will change the way you see everything that comes after. Lesson statement. Before we begin, here is what this story is really about. The most powerful thing a woman can do is not to wait to be saved. It is to prepare, quietly and completely, for the truth to arrive on her terms. If you have ever loved someone who did not love you back the way you deserved, this story is for you. If you have ever stayed silent while you were building something, this story is for you. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, share it with them right now. Because some stories find the people who need them most. Hit like if you are staying until the end. Leave a comment and tell us, have you ever known someone like Clara? Someone who was stronger than anyone realized? And if you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. We tell stories like this every week. Stories about women who chose themselves. Stories that stay with you. Now, let us begin.
The monitor beeped twice. Then it changed its sound. Not an alarm, not yet. Something quieter than an alarm. A shift in rhythm. The way a song changes key before the chorus. The way weather changes before the storm arrives. Clara Whitfield heard it from the hospital bed and felt her body respond before her mind caught up. She pressed one hand flat against her stomach. In, out, in, out. The contraction passed like something breaking against a wall, and she went slack against the pillow and reached for her phone on the blanket beside her. She had called Edmund 4 times. 4 times, straight to voicemail. Not even a ring first, straight to the recorded voice that said he was unavailable and to please leave a message after the tone. She had not left a message. She locked the screen, unlocked it, locked it again, unlocked it, locked it, put it face down on the blanket beside her hip, picked it up again, checked the time. 3:47 in the afternoon. She had been in this room for 2 hours and 14 minutes. The contractions had started at noon, faint and irregular, the kind the books described as practice. The kind you were supposed to time and wait on. By 2 o'clock, they were no longer faint. By 3:15, they were no longer ignorable. She had called Janine first. This was the thing she would not examine too closely later. She had called Janine first, not Edmund. Janine first, and then Edmund. And the order of those calls said something she was not ready to say out loud. Janine Crawford had been at her kitchen table when Clara called. She had her coat on and her keys in her hand before Clara finished the second sentence. That was Janine. That had always been Janine. 14 years of friendship, and Janine had never once made her ask twice for anything. Now Janine stood at the window of the labor room, with her arms crossed and her back to the room. She was watching the parking lot below with the particular stillness of a woman managing something too large for the available space. He knew this week was close, Clara said. I know, Janine said. He said the board meeting ended at noon. I know. It's been almost 4 hours, Janine. Janine turned from the window. Her face was composed in the way faces are composed when the person wearing them has made a deliberate decision and about what not to say. She crossed to the chair beside Clara's bed and sat down and took Clara's hand without being asked. "The doctor is coming," Janine said. "Let's just focus on that right now." The room smelled of antiseptic and freesia. Someone had placed a small glass vase of white freesia on the window ledge. Clara had mentioned once, during her third prenatal appointment, that freesia was her favorite flower. The nursing staff had remembered. It was a small thing. She had always noticed small things. The large ones had become increasingly difficult to find. Nurse Addie Carr came through the door with a blood pressure cuff and a portable monitor and the focused energy of someone who had already assessed the room upon entering and was several steps ahead of everyone in it. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "how are we doing on the pain scale?" "7," Clara said. "Maybe 7.5. And the contractions are coming how close together now?" 3 minutes, sometimes 2.5. Addie wrapped the cuff around Clara's arm with practiced efficiency and watched the reading climb. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened and reset. "I'm going to page Dr. Sorn," she said. "Right now." "Is something wrong?" Clara asked. "I want the doctor to take a look, just to be safe." She was already moving toward the door. She paused with one hand on the frame and turned back. "Is your husband on his way?" Clara looked at her phone, face down on the blanket. She looked at it the way you look at something you have stopped expecting anything from. "I've been trying to reach him," she said. Addie held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she nodded once and stepped out into the corridor. Janine squeezed Clara's hand and said nothing. There was nothing to say that Clara did not already know. The hospital's patient coordinator tried Edmund's office at Janine's request. A different assistant answered this time. There was a pause that lasted 4 seconds too long. Then, with the careful blankness of someone who had been trained to reveal nothing, "Mr. Whitfield is currently unavailable." Currently unavailable. Clara closed her eyes. She was 37 weeks pregnant with twins. She had chosen the nursery colors herself, a soft sage green, because she had not known the genders until 6 weeks ago and had decided to keep the color for both regardless. She had spent a Saturday afternoon folding tiny onesies while the radio played in the kitchen. She had read bedtime stories to her own stomach, pressing the open book flat against her skin, feeling the twins kick at the rhythm of her voice. She had done everything right. She had done all of it because Edmund was always traveling, always in a meeting, always tied up, always, in the particular language of his absence, currently unavailable. She opened her eyes and looked at Janine. "Okay," she said. "Let's focus." The next contraction came at 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Clara gripped the bed rail with her free hand and breathed through it and counted and told herself she was fine. She was handling it. She had handled everything else. Addie Carr was back in 4 minutes, with Dr. Patricia Sorn behind her. Dr. Sorn was 52 years old, with silver-streaked hair cut short, in the manner of someone who had spent 3 decades in labor and delivery and had learned that calm was not a feeling, but a choice you made on behalf of the person in front of you. She reviewed the monitor readout without speaking. She pressed both hands gently against Clara's abdomen, reading the position of the twins through her palms the way experienced obstetricians do, through years of accumulated knowledge in their fingertips. She asked 3 specific questions in a measured voice. Then she said, "Clara, I need to tell you what I'm seeing." "Tell me everything," Clara said. "The second baby has shifted position since your last ultrasound on Monday. Your blood pressure is elevated, and it's climbing. Together, those 2 things mean I want to move you to the surgical suite." "As a precaution," Clara said. "As a necessity, Dr. Soren said, and her voice was gentle and completely honest. I want to be ready to move quickly if we need to. Clara nodded. She was steady in a way that Addie Carr, watching from beside the monitor, recognized and filed away. This was not the steadiness of someone who was not afraid. This was the steadiness of someone who had been afraid for a long time already and had made their arrangements. Can someone try my husband one more time? Clara asked. The coordinator tried, straight to voicemail. Clara looked at the phone on the blanket beside her. She picked it up. She opened her contacts. She scrolled to Edmund's name. She looked at his name on the screen for a long moment, her thumb hovering without pressing. Then she put the phone face down on the blanket. She did not pick it up again. That was the first small grief. Not the blood pressure reading, not the shifted position of the second twin, the decision not to call again. The quiet final moment of accepting that she was going to do this alone, and that this was not a surprise, and that she had known for longer than she had admitted that it would come to this. She had known for a very long time. They moved her bed through the corridor with the practiced speed of people who had done this before. The ceiling tiles passed overhead in a white, even rhythm. The fluorescent lights were very bright. Clara counted them. Addie Carr walked beside the bed. One hand rested lightly on the rail. She was not required to do this. It was not written in any protocol or job description. She did it because Clara Whitfield had looked at her with eyes that said clearly and without words, I am more frightened than I am showing, and I need someone to simply walk beside me. Addie walked beside her. The smell of freesia faded as they moved down the corridor. The smell of antiseptic intensified. The surgical suite doors swung open, and the room was cold and white and waiting. The monitors already positioned. 3 nurses in blue, moving with the choreographed efficiency of people who had prepared for exactly this. Dr. Soren took her position at the foot of the table and looked at Clara over the top of her mask. You're going to be all right, she said. Clara looked back at her. Her blood pressure was 162 over 104. Her hands on the table beside her were completely still. Take care of them first, Clara said. The babies, whatever happens, them first. Dr. Soren held her gaze for 1 full second. Understood, she said. The monitor changed its sound again. Dr. Soren looked at it. She looked at Addie. A single nod passed between them, the wordless communication of people who have worked together long enough to speak in glances. They moved. Clara felt the ceiling lights multiply and blur above her. She felt the cold spreading up her arm from the IV line. She felt the room tilt, the way rooms tilt when the medication begins, a gentle sideways drift, the world becoming gauze. She thought about the freesia on the window ledge in the labor room. She thought about the small potted plant she had placed in the nursery, on the window ledge beside the crib, because she had read that plants make a room feel lived in, feel cared for. She thought, someone should water it. She thought, I was not going to wait for him anymore. I had decided that. After this was over, I had decided. I was not going to wait ever again. She did not finish the thought. The room went white and quiet. 7 miles from Mercy Summit Hospital, on the 43rd floor of the Whitfield Towers residential annex, the candles were beeswax. Veronica Hale had ordered them specifically from a shop on the east side of the city that charged 4 times what standard candles cost, and delivered them wrapped in tissue paper with a handwritten card. She had also ordered the wine, a bottle from a vineyard in Bordeaux that had cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. She had ordered white ranunculus for the table, arranged low in a crystal bowl so they would not block the view of the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She had done all of this because she understood Edmund Whitfield. She had studied him for 14 months with the focused attention of a scientist observing a specific and valuable organism. She knew that he responded to beauty the way a compass responds to north, automatically, without deliberate choice. He moved toward beautiful things, always had, and she had made herself into the most beautiful thing in his vicinity and kept herself there through consistent, careful effort. Edmund sat at the dining table with his jacket on the back of his chair and his tie loosened and his phone placed face down in the entryway where Veronica had suggested he leave it when he arrived. 2 hours, she had said, taking it from his hand with a smile that cost her nothing. The board is handled. Your assistant knows where you are. Claire has 3 more weeks. He had handed it over because handing it over was easier than having the conversation about why he should keep it. Edmund Whitfield had spent the last 2 years making small concessions in the direction of easier. The concessions had accumulated into a life he had not exactly chosen, but had not exactly refused either. He looked at the wine in his glass. He looked at the ranunculus in the crystal bowl. He looked at Veronica across the table, who was watching him with the particular attention she brought to evaluating his mood. "You seem distracted," she said. "Clara's due date is in 3 weeks," he said. "It's always something with her." Her voice was light, easy, the voice of someone for whom other people's difficulties were primarily inconveniences. She reached across and refilled his glass. "Eat your dinner." He ate his dinner. This was the important thing to understand about Edmund Whitfield. He was not a man who had decided to be cruel. Cruelty requires intention, and Edmund's failing was not intention, but its absence. He was a man who had told himself a series of comfortable lies across a period of years, and the lies had accumulated the way debts accumulate when you stop opening the envelopes, into something far larger than he had intended to carry. He had told himself he would end things with Veronica once the babies arrived. He had told himself Clara would never know. He had told himself that writing the checks, managing the estate, arranging the private hospital with its premium rooms and its thoughtful nursing staff, that all of this constituted love, the practical kind, the sustainable kind, the kind that kept the machinery running even when the warmth had cooled. He was wrong about every single one of those things, and somewhere beneath the Bordeaux and the beeswax candles, in the room inside himself that he preferred not to open, he knew it. He had known it for longer than he wanted to examine. Veronica watched him over her wine glass. She was 31 years old and had never confused sentiment with strategy. She had been her father Thomas Hale's most valuable asset since she was old enough to be presented at the kind of events where assets were displayed, and she had made her peace with that transaction because the alternative was a life of smaller rooms and cheaper wine and no access to the rooms where the decisions were made. She understood exactly what she was. She also understood, with the cold clarity she kept carefully hidden behind her warmth, that Clara's pregnancy had complicated the mathematics of her arrangement with Edmund in ways she had not fully anticipated when she had begun it. Twins, 2 heirs, the estate succession documents, updated accordingly, filed before the birth, 2 biological claims on everything Edmund Whitfield owned and would own. She looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind Edmund's shoulder. She looked at it the way you look at something you are calculating the dimensions of. In the entryway, Edmund's phone lay face down on the console table. The screen lit up. Once, twice, 3 times. The pale blue glow pulsed against the wall in a soft and insistent rhythm, like something pressing against a door from the other side. Edmund could not hear it. The Italian music was playing. The candles were warm. The wine was excellent. The screen lit up again and again and again. 7 miles away, the surgical suite doors had already closed. In the hospital corridor outside the surgical suite, Janine Crawford was not sitting down. She was moving. The way she moved when she needed her body to process something her mind could not yet contain. She walked to the end of the corridor and back. She walked to the water fountain and stood in front of it without drinking. She called Edmund's direct line and got his voicemail and ended the call. She called Philip, his personal assistant, who said Mr. Whitfield had left the office at noon and had not been in contact since. She called Dale Whitfield, Edmund's brother. No answer. She stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the corridor under the fluorescent lights, with the smell of antiseptic and the distant sound of a newborn crying in the ward down the hall. Someone else's baby, someone else's news. She took out her phone. She opened the call log. She looked at it for a moment. 11 calls to Edmund's number, each one time-stamped. Each one marked as unanswered in the phone's own record. The log was a document of something. She was not yet sure what, but she understood instinctively that it needed to exist somewhere permanent. She took a screenshot. She took another one from a different angle. She did not fully know why. She did it because she needed to do something with her hands, and because something in her had shifted in the last hour from worry into a quieter and colder state that she would later understand was preparation. She was a woman who prepared. She always had been. Claire had loved that about her, had relied on it, had sometimes laughed about it. She sent the screenshots to her email. Then she called Ruth Whitfield. Ruth answered on the second ring, which was not like Ruth, who answered phones on her own schedule and no one else's. "Ruth," Janine said, "Clara is in emergency surgery. Edmund is unreachable. I thought you should know." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Not the silence of shock, the silence of a 71-year-old woman receiving information and deciding what it required of her. "Which hospital?" Ruth said. "Mercy Summit, private entrance on the north side. I will be there in 20 minutes. She hung up. Janine stood in the corridor with her phone in her hand. She looked at the double doors at the end of the hall, the ones that led to the surgical suite, the ones that were closed and were going to stay closed until something happened on the other side of them. She sat down on a chair against the wall. She waited. Inside the surgical suite, the first twin arrived at 5:41 in the afternoon. A boy, 6 pounds, 2 ounces. His cry hit the room like a statement, sharp and insistent and furious at being rushed into the world before he had finished whatever he had been doing in there. Addie Carr recorded the time and looked at Dr. Soren's eyes above the mask and saw the focus there that meant 1 down, 1 to go, and the second one is where the difficulty lives. The second twin had shifted further during the procedure, the smaller of the two. Dr. Soren worked with the quiet, compressed efficiency of someone who has made a decision not to have feelings about this until later. "Pressure," she said. "More pressure. Come on, come on." There. The girl arrived at 5:46. 4 pounds, 11 ounces. She did not cry immediately. The room held its breath for 3 seconds, which lasted much longer than 3 seconds. Then she cried. Small, high, absolutely certain of her own existence. Addie felt something release in her chest. Both babies were breathing. Clara was not. The flatline came at 5:53 in the afternoon. Dr. Soren called it in the formal, final way that doctors call it, the phrase that closes a door that cannot be reopened. She stood still afterward, for the span of 3 full breaths. This was what she did. She stood still and let the weight of it arrive. Then she looked at her team. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. In the corridor, Janine looked up when she saw Addie come through the doors. She knew before Addie reached her. She knew from the way Addie was walking, and the way Addie's face was arranged, and the way Addie sat down beside her without being asked and took both of Janine's hands in both of hers. She knew. She sat with it for a moment, the knowing. Then she said, "The babies. Both alive," Addie said. "Both breathing, a boy and a girl." Janine nodded. She kept nodding for a moment after she had stopped needing to. "Okay," she said. She was not going to cry here, in this corridor, under these lights. She was going to cry later, in her car, alone, for as long as it took. Right now there were things that needed doing, and she was the person who did things that needed doing. She had always been that person. She took out her phone and called Benton Shaw, whose card she had in her wallet, because Clara had given it to her 3 weeks ago with the quiet casualness of someone who is not being casual at all. The consultation room had a small table and 4 chairs and a box of tissues and a window that looked at a brick wall. Janine sat across from the grief counselor, who was a kind woman in a blue cardigan who spoke in the careful, measured voice of someone trained for exactly this. Janine heard the words without quite processing them. She was watching the brick wall through the window and thinking about Clara's plants. Clara had 7 plants in her house. Janine knew each of them. The trailing pothos in the kitchen window that Clara had named Gerald because it was indestructible and slightly boring. The fiddle-leaf fig in the living room that Clara worried about constantly. The small succulent arrangement on the bathroom windowsill. The potted rosemary by the kitchen door. And in the nursery, on the window ledge beside the crib, a single small plant in a ceramic pot, painted pale blue, that Clara had found at a market and carried home on the bus because she wanted something living in the room before the babies arrived. "Her plants," Janine said. The grief counselor paused in whatever she had been saying. "Someone needs to water her plants," Janine said. The counselor wrote something in her notebook. She said something gentle about practical concerns being a normal response to shock. Janine was not in shock. She was in the very clear and cold place that lived just past shock, the place where everything becomes specific and manageable because specific and manageable was the only way through. She opened her phone. She started to type a text to Clara. 3 words in, her finger stopped. She looked at Clara's name at the top of the message thread. She looked at the last message Clara had sent her 2 days ago, a photograph of the sage green nursery with both cribs assembled and the small blue pot on the window ledge. Clara had added a single line below the photograph. Almost ready. Janine put the phone face down on the table. She was not going to cry in this room. She excused herself. She thanked the counselor. She walked to the bathroom at the end of the corridor and stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists for 30 seconds. She looked at her own face in the mirror. Then she went to find Benton Shaw's number and call him. Now, here's what no one in that hospital knew yet. 6 weeks before that night, on a Tuesday afternoon in early February, Clara Whitfield had taken the train downtown and walked 4 blocks to the office of Estate Attorney Benton Shaw and sat down across from his desk and said, "I need to create a sealed document, not to be opened until my death or my written authorization. I have a specific list of contents and a specific list of people who must be present when it's opened." Benton Shaw had practiced estate law for 30 years. He had prepared documents for the grieving and the frightened, and the angry and the strategic. He had not, in 30 years, prepared a document quite like what Clara described. She was 7 months pregnant. She sat in the chair across from his desk, with her hands folded in her lap, and her voice steady and her instructions precise. She did not cry. She did not apologize for taking his time. She did not qualify what she was asking with phrases like, "I know this might sound strange," or "I hope I'm being overly cautious." She simply told him what she needed and waited for him to confirm he could provide it. She had spent 4 months gathering what was in the document. She had hired a private investigator quietly, paying from a personal savings account Edmund had stopped monitoring 2 years ago when he stopped paying attention to the smaller details of their shared finances. The investigator's report was thorough. 14 months of documented contact between Edmund and Veronica Hale. Specific dates, specific locations, photographs taken from public spaces. She had also found the transfers. 3 separate transactions over 6 months. $2,300,000 total, moved from a joint Whitfield holding account into a subsidiary company she had not recognized when she first saw the name on the statement. She had spent 2 weeks tracing the subsidiary. Its primary beneficiary was a man named Thomas Hale, Veronica's father. Clara had known about the affair for 4 months. She had known about the transfers for 6 weeks. She had said nothing to Edmund, to anyone, because she had been 32 weeks pregnant, and then 34 weeks, and then 36 weeks, and she had needed to get the children here first. Safe, documented, registered, born. Then she would do what needed doing. She had not counted on not being here to do it herself, but she had prepared for that possibility too. This was the universal realization, the moment that shifted everything. Clara Whitfield was not a woman who had been blindsided. She was not a woman waiting to be rescued. She was a woman who had looked clearly at her situation and made her arrangements with the time and the tools available to her. And then she had kept going to prenatal appointments and folding onesies and watering her 7 plants because that was also part of taking care of the people she loved. She had been building something. She had been building it the whole time. In the supply room, on the 3rd floor of Mercy Summit Hospital, Addie Carr stood with her back against the wall and cried for 4.5 minutes. She had worked as a labor nurse for 11 years, and she had a rule about crying, and the rule was that she did it privately, and she did it completely, and then she was done with it, and went back to work. She cried for 4.5 minutes. Then she washed her face and straightened her scrubs and went back to the warming unit where the boy was making small sounds of complaint. She put one finger in his hand. His grip was reflexive and immediate and fierce, the grip of someone who had just arrived and had no intention of letting go. She stood there with his fingers wrapped around hers and thought, "You have no idea what your mother left you. You have absolutely no idea what she built while she was building you." The boy's grip tightened. The girl was sleeping in the warming unit beside him, her palms open, as if she had already asked her first question and was waiting for the answer. Addie stood between them for a long time. Down the hall, Ruth Whitfield arrived at the hospital at 6:17 in the evening. She came through the private entrance in a dark coat with her silver hair immaculate and her posture the posture of someone who had commanded rooms for 50 years. She asked for Janine Crawford at the desk. She was directed down the corridor. Janine was standing outside the consultation room when Ruth came around the corner. They looked at each other. Ruth Whitfield was 71 years old and had built the Whitfield legacy alongside her husband George for 34 years and had walked through recessions and scandals and George's death and the particular daily erosion of a family that had too much money and not enough honesty. She was not a woman who showed what she was feeling in her face. She showed it now. "Tell me," she said. Janine told her. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Janine finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The babies. Both alive, boy and the girl." Ruth closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, something in her face had shifted, not softened exactly, clarified. "I want to see them," she said. Janine took her to the nursery window. Ruth stood at the glass and looked at Oliver and Elise Whitfield in their warming units, and she stood there without speaking for a very long time. Her hands at her sides were completely still. Her face was something Janine had never seen on Ruth Whitfield before, something stripped of its usual architecture, something that looked like grief and reckoning arriving at the same time. "I was not kind to her," Ruth said, very quietly, still looking at the babies. Janine said nothing. "I made her feel like a guest in her own family for 6 years. I was unkind to her in small ways that I told myself didn't count because they were small." She paused. "My husband George told me I was wrong about her. He said she was the most perceptive person in the room, and I was too proud to see it because she was quiet about it." She turned from the window. He was right. Janine looked at her. "I'm going to be different with those children," Ruth said. "I'm starting now." It was not an apology. It was something more durable than an apology. It was a statement of intent from a woman who understood that she was in the last portion of her life and had a finite number of chances left to be the person she should have been earlier. Janine believed her. Edmund Whitfield learned his wife was dead at 7:08 in the evening. He had finally retrieved his phone from Veronica's entryway at 6:50. Something had changed in the quality of the evening, some internal atmospheric shift from discomfort to dread, and he had said he needed to check in, and Veronica had not argued, and he had crossed to the entryway and turned the phone over. 37 missed calls, 14 text messages, 3 voicemails from a number he did not recognize, which was Mercy Summit Hospital, calling from their main line. He was still reading the screen when his phone rang. His mother. He answered before the second ring. Edmund. Her voice was completely flat. He had heard his mother's voice in every register across 44 years. Cold. Clipped. Warm on rare occasions. Disappointed in the specific way she'd reserved for him. He had never heard her voice completely flat before, emptied of everything, including the control. "Clara died at 5:53 this evening," she said. "Both babies survived. You have a son and a daughter." He could not speak. "I have been at Mercy Summit Hospital for the past hour," she said. "I have been the only Whitfield family member present at the birth and the death of your wife." He heard her breathe. "Where were you, Edmund?" Not a question. A verdict. "I was," he started. "I know where you were," she said. "The hospital called your office. Philip tried to reach you. Janine Crawford tried to reach you 11 times. Your wife died while you were at that woman's apartment with your phone face down." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man who has no defense because there is no defense. "Get to the hospital," Ruth said. "Get to your children." She ended the call. In the penthouse behind him, Veronica stood in the dining room doorway. She had heard enough. She had heard the flatness in his voice when he answered and the way it had dropped further as the call continued. She had heard the specific quality of the silence that followed. Edmund picked up his jacket from the back of the dining chair. He walked to the door without looking at her. She watched him go. She stood in the doorway of the candlelit dining room with the white ranunculus in the crystal bowl and the remains of the dinner on the table, and she watched the door close behind him. She stood very still for a long time. Edmund's driver made it to Mercy Summit in 11 minutes. Edmund walked through the private entrance and down the corridor with the speed of a man who needed to run but understood that running would mean admitting the full size of what he had done, and he was not ready to admit the full size yet, was not sure he would ever be ready. Addie Carr saw him coming from the nurse's station. She had seen fathers arrive late before. She had made her professional peace with the variety of reasons men arrived late to the births of their children. She looked at Edmund Whitfield coming down the corridor, and she made her assessment and filed it in the place she kept assessments. She took him to the nursery window. He stood at the glass, Oliver with his fist raised beside his cheek, sleeping now, the fury of his arrival temporarily satisfied. Elise with both palms open beside her face, as if she were asking something of the air above her. Edmund stood at the glass and did not move for 11 minutes. The corridor hummed with ventilation. A cart rolled past. Someone down the hall laughed briefly at something, the laugh of someone who did not know what had happened in the surgical suite 2 hours ago, the laugh of someone whose evening was going differently. Edmund stood at the glass and looked at his children and the thing that had been building in him since he turned his phone over in Veronica's entryway arrived in full. Not guilt, exactly. Though guilt was present. Something larger than guilt. The particular vertigo of a man who has been standing on ground he believed was solid, and has discovered in one evening that it is not and has never been. He was still at the glass when Janine found him. She had been waiting. She had been planning what she would say and how she would say it since she left the consultation room. She had decided she would say it quietly, because quiet was more powerful than loud. Because Clara had always said that the people most worth listening to were the ones who made you lean in to hear them. She stopped beside him at the window. She did not look at him. She looked at the twins. "She called you 4 times before they sedated her," Janine said. 4 times, Edmund. I watched her make those calls. Up, he started to speak. "I need you to not explain yourself to me right now," she said. "I need you to listen." She paused. "I know where you were. I know the name of the building. I know the name of the woman. I know because I drove there, after they told me Clara was gone, because I needed to do something with my hands, and I needed somewhere to go. I stood outside that building, and I looked up at it." Her voice was absolutely even. "I documented the call log before I understood why I was doing it. 11 calls, time-stamped and saved, and backed up to my email. That documentation exists. It is not going anywhere." Edmund had gone very still. "Those babies," Janine said, "are the only reason I am not burning your entire life down tonight. I want you to understand that clearly, and I want you to think very carefully about every single decision you make going forward." She turned and looked at him directly. He looked back at her. "She deserved better than you gave her," Janine said. "A great deal better. And now those children deserve better than what you've been. The question is whether you're capable of it." She walked away. She walked the length of the corridor and through the double doors and out into the cold night air and stood in the parking lot under the black sky and breathed. Then she took out her phone and called Benton Shaw. "She's gone," she said when he answered. "I need to know what we do next." Benton was quiet for a moment. "She was very specific about the sequence," he said. "We follow her sequence. I'll contact you tomorrow morning." "Tell me one thing tonight," Janine said. "Tell me she protected them." Another pause. "She protected them completely," Benton said. "She thought of everything." Janine stood in this cold parking lot and looked up at the lit windows of the hospital and thought about Clara at 7 months pregnant, taking the train downtown, walking 4 blocks to a lawyer's office, building a fortress with her own hands in the time she had. She thought, she always chose right. She just didn't always choose herself. She went back inside. Edmund was still at the nursery window. He had not moved. Back in the corridor outside the surgical suite, Ruth Whitfield sat in the hospital chapel for a long time. It was a small room, non-denominational, chairs arranged with mathematical symmetry, a low light that was neither warm nor cold. Ruth did not pray in any formal sense. She had never been a formally religious woman. But she spoke out loud to the room, which amounted to the same thing. She talked about Clara. She talked about the Christmas dinner, where Clara had quietly re-seasoned Ruth's famous gravy without saying anything, and the gravy had been better, and Ruth had never acknowledged it. She talked about the afternoon Clara had noticed that Ruth's gardener had left the back hedge uneven and had mentioned it to the groundskeeper directly without making it a conversation, fixing the thing without making it an occasion. She talked about the way Clara had looked at Edmund when he was not watching her, not with resentment, with a particular patient clarity, as if she were seeing him accurately and deciding every day whether what she saw was enough. Ruth said to the empty chapel, "I should have looked at her the way she looked at him. I should have tried to see her accurately." The room did not answer. Ruth sat for a while longer. Then she stood, straightened her coat, and went to sit outside the nursery and wait for morning. The estate attorney arrived at the Whitfield estate on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after Clara's death. The formal written notice had been sent the previous week, listing the parties required to be present. Benton Shaw did not call ahead, and he did not make exceptions to the list. Edmund sat at the head of the long dining table in the east wing. He had not slept properly in 10 days. He had the specific quality of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of what you are carrying when you try to sleep. Ruth sat to his left. She had come from the original Whitfield house, and she would return to it this evening. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed. Dale Whitfield sat across from his brother, 47 years old, soft at the jaw, with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades positioning himself as the reasonable alternative to Edmund in any room where alternatives were being considered. He had brought Greta, his wife, who sat beside him, with her hands folded and her eyes moving carefully around the room. Janine Crawford sat at the far end of the table. She had been named in the notice as a required attendee. Dale had seen her name on the list and said nothing, but something in his expression had shifted and reset. Benton Shaw placed the sealed envelope at the center of the table, cream-colored, heavy stock, Clara's personal wax seal on the flap, a small object carrying a very large weight. Dale reached toward it. Benton placed one hand flat on the table. "It's not yours to handle, Dale." Dale withdrew his hand. Benton opened the envelope with a letter opener he had brought himself, using the deliberate care of someone who understood that the act of opening this document was itself significant. He unfolded the pages inside. He looked around the table once. "Clara Whitfield prepared this document on the 4th of February, he said. "She was 29 years old. I witnessed the signing personally and can attest to her full clarity of mind. I am going to read the entire document without interruption." He began to read. The room was very quiet. He read the timeline first. 14 months of documented contact between Edmund Whitfield and Veronica Hale. Dates and locations, specific and precise. The investigator's name, license number, and complete formal report attached as exhibits. He read the financial records. 3 transactions across 6 months. $2,300,000 moved from a joint Whitfield holding account into a subsidiary company. The subsidiary company's beneficial owner, Thomas Hale. Greta's hands, folded on the table, were very still. Dale looked at Edmund. Edmund was looking at the document in Benton's hands with the expression of a man watching something inevitable arrive. Benton read the final section. Clara's formal request that in the event of her death, the guardianship of Oliver and Elise Whitfield be reviewed by a family court judge rather than automatically assumed by Edmund, given the documented evidence of his conduct throughout her pregnancy. She named two people she trusted to support her children's interests: Janine Crawford, Ruth Whitfield. Benton put the pages down. The room was silent for a long time. Dale was the first to speak. He said something that began with the word naturally and moved toward phrases like the institution, and we have to be rational. And I'm sure Edmund would agree that the children's welfare is the priority, Ruth said. Stop talking, Dale. He stopped. Edmund had not spoken at all. He sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on the wood and his eyes somewhere above Benton's left shoulder. Is anything in that document inaccurate? Benton asked him. Edmund was silent for a moment. No, he said. Benton collected the pages. Then we moved to the next step, which Clara also specified. He looked at Edmund with the steady, professional gaze of a man who has seen many things and is not here to judge them, but is here to ensure that the instructions of his client are followed precisely. She was very thorough. She was, Ruth said. She stood. She buttoned her jacket. She looked at Edmund with the expression she had been composing for 10 days, the one that contained no performance and no strategy, just the clear, quiet sight of a mother looking at her son and seeing him honestly. I'll be at the house, she said. When you're ready. She left. Greta stood to follow Dale, who was already moving toward the door with the purposeful air of someone who had places to be and calls to make. At the doorway, Greta stopped. She turned back. She looked at Janine at the far end of the table. Something passed between them, not words, a kind of recognition. Two women in a room full of men who had been making decisions about things that would affect them, looking at each other and understanding something simultaneously. Greta gave a single, barely perceptible nod. Janine nodded back. The story broke in the financial press by that evening, not the affair. Affairs were not news for families at this level of wealth. What was news was the transfers, $2,300,000. The subsidiary, Thomas Hale's name attached to it as beneficial owner. The question of whether the CEO of Whitfield Industries had redirected estate funds during his wife's pregnancy into an account connected to his mistress's father. That was news. The Whitfield Industries board convened an emergency call. Dale made himself very available for quiet comment to 3 board members separately, each conversation beginning with the phrase naturally, I support my brother, and ending somewhere in the vicinity of the institution must be protected. Veronica saw the story at 6 in the evening on the financial news application she kept on her phone. She was in the penthouse. The white ranunculus had begun to brown at the edges. She had not replaced them. Her father called at 6:15. Thomas Hale spoke in the careful, modulated tone of a man recalibrating in real time. He did not say anything that could be characterized as incriminating. He said that circumstances had become complicated and that careful management was essential and that the window for certain outcomes was narrowing. Manage this, he said, before it manages you. Veronica looked at the browning flowers. She had always been good at managing things. She had been managing things since she was old enough to understand that being manageable herself was not a strategy that served her interests. She had managed rooms and relationships and situations that other people would have found impossible, and she had done it well, and she was going to do it now. She thought about the twins. She thought about what it would mean to become, in some capacity, essential to those children. Not as a stepmother, not yet, perhaps never in that precise form, but as a presence, someone who was there, someone Edmund associated with stability and care during the most destabilized period of his life. She picked up her phone. She called a car service. She had a plan. She always had a plan. She thought, I still have moves. She was right about the first thing. She was very wrong about the second. She arrived at the Whitfield estate on the 7th day. She wore gray, soft, and muted, a color that communicated something in the direction of mourning without committing to it fully, which was the precise calibration she needed. She had retired the red 4 days after Clara's death. She understood that optics were architecture. Every visible choice was a structural decision. She carried 2 cashmere baby blankets, pale yellow, gender neutral, purchased from a shop on the Upper East Side that wrapped everything in tissue paper. She had a handwritten card in an envelope. Her handwriting was beautiful. She had practiced it for years. The housekeeper, Margaret, who had been with the Whitfield family for 17 years and had her own clear and unspoken opinions about Veronica Hale, let her in because she was not authorized to refuse a guest and because Edmund was home and had been told she was coming. Edmund received her in the library. Veronica stood in the center of the room rather than sitting immediately, which was a deliberate choice, a way of taking up space without appearing to claim it. She looked at Edmund with an expression she had spent the car ride composing: concern, warmth, the particular sadness of someone who cares but does not want to intrude. I'm not here to make anything harder, she said. I just needed to see you. I needed to know you were managing. Edmund looked at her. He looked tired in the way people look tired when the exhaustion is coming from inside rather than from lack of sleep. The babies need stability above everything else, she said. Consistent, loving people around them. I want to be one of those people, not as anything that makes this more complicated, just as someone who cares about you and because of that, cares about them. She set the cashmere blankets on the table beside her. I know the legal situation is complicated, she said. I know what the document contained. I'm not asking you to defend anything. I'm asking for the chance to be useful, that's all. It was flawless. In the hallway outside the library, Nurse Addie Carr was passing with a stack of clean linens for the nursery. She had been hired as a private nursing consultant for the twins' first 2 weeks, an arrangement Janine had put in motion through Dr. Soren's office, while Edmund was still too stunned to make household decisions independently. Addie passed the library door. She was not moving quickly. She heard Veronica's voice and the words consistent and loving and caring, and she kept walking. She did not slow down. She carried the linens to the nursery and set them in the cabinet. She stood in the sage-green room for a moment, the small blue ceramic pot on the window ledge, still alive. She had watered it herself this morning. She had been watering it every morning since she arrived. She took out her phone. She had Janine's number. She had kept it since the night in the hospital corridor, kept it the way you keep a thing when you know you will need it, even if you cannot yet say exactly when. She typed, "The woman from the papers is here. Edmund is in the library with her. Thought you should know." She sent it and put the phone back in her pocket. She picked up Oliver from his crib because he was awake and looking at the ceiling with the focused intensity of someone conducting important research, and she sat in the rocking chair with him. The cream upholstery, pale and soft, the chair Clara had found at an estate sale and spent a Saturday reupholstering with fabric samples spread across the kitchen table and the radio playing. Addie had heard this detail from Margaret, who had been there that Saturday and who had, in her 17 years with the Whitfield family, never seen any other member of the family spend a Saturday doing something like that. Oliver looked up at her. She said, very quietly, so the room could hear it, even if he could not yet, Your mother sat in this chair and thought about you before you arrived. She sat here and thought about what kind of room she wanted you to come home to. Oliver made a small sound. Not quite contentment, something on its way there. In the library, Veronica was reaching the end of her visit. She had said what she came to say. She had delivered the blankets and the card. She had made her case with the precision of someone who had prepared it carefully. Now she was reading Edmund's face and finding something there that she did not like. Edmund said, "I appreciate you coming." She recognized the tone. She had heard it from men before. The courtesy that is actually a closing door. She recognized it, and she adjusted her expression, and she waited. "Benton is filing paperwork this week," Edmund said, "for the family court review. It's going to be a formal process." "I understand," she said. "I think it would be better," he said, choosing each word with the careful deliberateness of someone who was not used to choosing words carefully and was trying to learn, "if you weren't part of that process, if you gave us some distance during it." A silence. Veronica looked at him. She read the set of his jaw, the stillness of his hands, the way he was looking at the window rather than at her, which was either cowardice or consideration, and she was no longer sure which. "Of course," she said. Her voice was warm and accommodating, and revealed nothing. She left the blankets on the table. She left the house. She sat in the back of the car and watched the estate gates close behind her in the rearview mirror. She looked at the gates until they were out of sight. Her father called 20 minutes later. She did not answer. She looked out the window at the city passing. She thought, "This is not over. I have not been defeated. I have been temporarily redirected, and I will find another approach, and I will be patient, and I will wait, and the right moment will come." She believed this completely. She was wrong to believe it, but she would not know that until the memorial. Ruth Whitfield made the tea herself. Benton Shaw arrived at the original Whitfield house at 10 in the morning, and Ruth had the kettle on and 2 cups on the table in the sitting room, off the kitchen, and no household staff visible anywhere on the ground floor. Benton understood the tea protocol. He had known Ruth Whitfield for 26 years. When she made the tea herself, it meant the conversation was personal, and it meant she was not his employer in this room. He accepted his cup and sat down across from her. "Tell me what Clara left for the twins," Ruth said. Benton said, "Ruth, there are legal limitations on what I can share outside of the formal." "Benton," she said, "I was at that hospital. I held those children the night they were born when their father was not there. I sat outside the nursery until 4 in the morning because someone with the name Whitfield needed to be present. Now tell me what that girl left for her children," he told her. It took 45 minutes. Ruth listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, both essentially the same question in different words. Was Clara protecting the children from Edmund specifically, or from anyone who might prioritize the estate's interests over theirs? Benton considered it carefully. "From anyone," he said. She was precise in her language. She did not characterize Edmund as an enemy. She characterized him as someone who would need support to be the father the children required. She was protective rather than punitive. There is a significant difference. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "She did it right," she said. "She did. She didn't do it in anger. No, both times I met with her, she was completely composed, not cold. There is a difference between composed and cold, and she was very much the former." Ruth set down her teacup. She looked at the window through which George's garden was visible, still maintained exactly as he had arranged it. The gardener following the original design without deviation because Ruth had asked him to. "I was not kind to her," Ruth said. Benton said nothing. This was not a legal matter. It did not require his response. I told my husband she was pleasant but shallow. George told me I was wrong. He said she was the most perceptive person we knew, and I had decided she was shallow because it was easier than making room for her. She paused. He was right. She was perceptive. She noticed everything, and she never made a performance of noticing. She just quietly did something about whatever she noticed, without needing credit for it, without making it an occasion. I found that quality irritating for years. She stopped. I found it irritating, she said, because it was the same quality George had, and I missed him terribly, and seeing it in her just reminded me of what I had lost, and I was unkind to her for that reason, which is the worst kind of unkindness, the kind that has nothing to do with the person you're being unkind to. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, the wind moved through George's hedges. I want to be formally positioned in the guardianship review, Ruth said. On Claire's side of it, supporting her wishes, not Edmund's interests. That will complicate his position significantly, Benton said. Yes, it will. He may experience it as a betrayal. What he did to that girl during her pregnancy, Ruth said, was a betrayal. What I am doing is attempting to correct a course that should never have veered this far. She met Benton's eyes. I am 71 years old. I do not have the luxury of taking the long way around difficult things anymore. I want to do this right while I still can. Benton looked at her for a moment. I'll need a personal statement from you, he said. Not legal language. Clara wrote to the judge, personally. The court will respond better to consistency of voice. I can do that, Ruth said. After Benton left, Ruth went to the small room beside the kitchen, where George's reading chair still sat in the corner. She had not moved it or replaced it or had it reupholstered. It was worn at the left armrest, because George had held his book in his right hand always. She sat in it. She picked up the wedding photograph from the side table beside the chair, Edmund and Clara. The ceremony had been simple, simpler than Ruth had thought appropriate for a Whitfield wedding. But looking at the photograph now, she saw something she had always looked past when she looked at it. Clara was laughing, full and completely unself-conscious, head tipped slightly back because someone had told a terrible joke at exactly the wrong moment during the ceremony. Not a polite laugh, a real one. The whole face involved. Ruth was visible in the background of the shot, looking at Clara with an expression that read clearly across the years, I do not understand you. Ruth looked at herself, looking at Clara. She should have tried harder to understand. She should have leaned in the way you lean in when someone is saying something worth hearing. She set the photograph down carefully. She thought about Oliver with his fist raised beside his cheek. She thought about Elise with her palms open. She thought about what kind of grandmother she was going to be for them, starting from now. Starting from the ground up, built on something more honest than what she had managed with their mother. She thought, those children deserve better than to inherit our failures. That is the one thing I can still give them, the decision to do better. Edmund came to the original house that evening. He let himself in with the key he had kept since childhood, through the side door that had always stuck slightly in winter. He found Ruth in the kitchen, with a fresh pot of tea and 2 cups. He sat down, he held his cup in both hands. I blocked her number, he said. Veronica, this afternoon. Ruth looked at her son. It's not enough, he said. I know it isn't. No, Ruth said. It isn't. But it's something. It is a beginning, she said. The first step of a long walk. They sat in the kitchen where Edmund had grown up, in the particular silence of 2 people who have not been fully honest with each other for a long time and are, tentatively, and with difficulty, beginning to try. Outside, in George's garden, the wind moved through the hedges with the sound of something settling. Edmund looked at his cup. She knew, he said. About Veronica, about the transfers. She knew everything. Ruth said nothing. She knew, and she didn't say anything to me. She just kept going, kept taking care of everything, kept building the nursery and going to her appointments, and he stopped. He was quiet for a moment. I thought I knew who she was. I thought I understood her. I had decided she was uncomplicated because it was easier than actually seeing her. He put the cup down. She was the least uncomplicated person I have ever known, he said. I was just too comfortable to look. Ruth looked at her son. She did not say, "You're right." She did not say, "I know." She said, "What are you going to do about it?" He was quiet for a long time. "Whatever Benton needs me to do," he said finally. "Whatever the court requires. Whatever the children need." Ruth nodded once. "Then start there," she said. Clara Whitfield's memorial service was held on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after her death. Her family drove from Ohio. Her parents, Barbara and Dawn. Her sister, a quiet woman named Carol, who had Clara's coloring and a different kind of stillness. 2 cousins who stood together near the door and spoke to almost no one. They were ordinary people in their best clothes. They looked at the Whitfield estate with the careful expressions of people trying very hard not to look at the Whitfield estate. People who understood they were in a different world from the one they inhabited and were navigating it with dignity. Barbara Whitfield, Clara's mother, stood in front of the framed photograph at the entrance to the reception hall for a very long time. It was a photograph from month 6 of the pregnancy. Clara was standing in the sage-green nursery with one hand resting on her stomach, looking at something outside the frame, not posed, caught mid-thought. Whatever she had been thinking in that moment had given her face the expression of someone who is completely, quietly at peace. Barbara stood in front of that photograph for so long that Carol came to stand beside her and took her hand without saying anything. Addie Carr arrived quietly and found a place near the edge of the room. She had come because this was what she did with patients who stayed with her. She did not announce herself. She did not expect to be recognized. She just came and stood near the edge and was present. Janine moved through the room with the focused attention of someone who had a specific purpose. She spoke to Clara's family. She made sure Barbara had water and a chair. She kept her eyes on the room. Veronica Hale arrived at 11:15. She wore the gray dress and the silver pin at her collar. She had researched what appropriate peripheral mourning looked like, and she had dressed accordingly. She shook hands with the people she knew. She offered condolences in the right language. She moved through the room with the practiced ease of someone who had been performing in rooms like this since she was old enough to understand what performance was. The reception moved to the East Drawing Room in the early afternoon. Someone had decided to serve champagne. This was, in retrospect, the decision that changed everything. Veronica found herself in the East Drawing Room with Greta, 2 of Edmund's business associates, and their spouses. The champagne was poured. The conversation was doing what conversation at memorials does when it tries to be positive, circling around words like legacy and beautiful babies, and she would have been so proud. One of the associates' wives said how sad it was, how the twins would grow up without knowing their mother. "Those poor little things," she said. "They'll never really know her." And Veronica, who had been performing perfect composure for 3 weeks, who had been calculating and managing and adjusting and recalibrating every single day since the night Edmund walked out of her penthouse, felt something loosen. 14 months of precise, careful, exhausting performance, something gave way. "Well," she said. Her voice was low and dry, the voice she used when she was among people she considered her equals and was letting down the formal register slightly. The voice that said, "We're all adults here. We can acknowledge difficult things." "At least they won't grow up watching her cry every time Edmund worked late." She said it quickly. She added a small, dry laugh at the end. The laugh of someone releasing pressure that had built beyond their management. The laugh of someone who had, for 3 unguarded seconds, forgotten where they were and who was listening. The silence that followed was not the polite silence of people pretending not to have heard something. It was the weighted, specific silence of people who have heard something clearly and are deciding what to do with the hearing of it. Greta set her champagne glass down on the table with a soft, precise click. She excused herself from the group in the quiet, unremarkable way she had excused herself from everything for 20 years. The way she had learned to leave rooms without drawing attention, which was a skill she had developed over 2 decades of being underestimated by everyone in this family, of being brought to meetings as a witness and then treated as furniture, of knowing things and being expected to hold them quietly. She crossed the reception hall. She found Janine near the tea table, standing with Addie Carr. "I need to tell you something I just heard," Greta said. Janine looked at her. Something in Janine recognized immediately what this was. "I need you to say it again," Janine said. "Into this." She held out her phone with the voice memo application already open. Greta looked at the phone. She thought about 20 years of staying quiet in rooms where she was not supposed to matter. She thought about Dale's careful, positioning comments to the board members. She thought about being brought to the estate meeting as Dale's witness and then filing everything she saw and heard, because filing things was what she did. It was her only available power until now. She spoke clearly into the phone. She repeated Veronica's exact words, the context, the tone, the small, dry laugh. Janine saved the recording. She looked at Greta. "Thank you," she said. Greta said, "Use it correctly." She turned and walked back toward the drawing room. She picked up her champagne glass where she had left it. She stood beside Dale and smiled at whatever he was saying. At the tea table, Janine and Addie stood close together. "I have something too," Addie said, "about the night Clara came in." She told Janine about the hospital's internal call log. 11 attempts to reach Edmund over 3 hours, documented automatically by the hospital's own system, each one time-stamped, an official institutional record that existed independently of anything Janine had saved on her personal phone. "Is that accessible?" Janine said. "It is a hospital administrative record," Addie said carefully. "A hospital administrator with appropriate legal authorization could access it. Benton Shaw would know how to proceed." Janine nodded. They stood at the tea table in the middle of the memorial reception for a woman they had both loved, surrounded by flowers and the low sound of voices and the gentle clink of cups. And they were, in that moment, the 2 most consequential people in the room. Neither of them looked it. This was, the story understood, how it usually worked. Benton Shaw slipped out of the reception at 2:30 to take a phone call. He was gone for 3 minutes. He came back in through the side door. He moved through the room until he caught Ruth's eye. He gave a single, brief nod. Ruth set down her cup. She excused herself from the conversation she was in with Clara's family, touching Barbara's arm gently as she left and crossed to where Benton was standing near the doorway. He leaned close. "Court date confirmed," he said quietly. "Judge Christine Waverly, 3 weeks from Tuesday." Ruth looked at him. "Good," she said. She returned to the reception. Veronica left an hour later, having recomposed herself within 30 seconds of the laugh, having smoothed the moment over with something charming and moved the conversation along and been impeccably managed for the remainder of the afternoon. She did not know about Greta's phone. She did not know about the hospital call log. She did not know about the court date. She left the memorial believing the morning had gone as planned. This was the most dangerous kind of mistake, the kind you cannot see because you are inside it. Family court convened on a Tuesday morning in a building that smelled of old coffee and institutional carpet. The courtroom was beige. The fluorescent lighting buzzed at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious annoyance. The chairs were the chairs of a room that had been furnished for function by people who considered comfort a secondary concern. Judge Christine Waverly had been doing this work for 22 years. She was 60 years old, silver hair, reading glasses on a chain, and she had the quality that the best judges have. The quality of being genuinely unimpressed by the things that usually impress people. Wealth, names, the quality of someone's suit, or the number of attorneys they had brought. She was, however, impressed by preparation. She had read the documents submitted in advance. She had read them twice and made notes in red pen in the margins. Edmund sat at the primary table with his attorney. He looked like a man who had aged 5 years and 3 weeks, which was approximately accurate. Ruth sat to his left. She had insisted on sitting at the table rather than in the gallery, and Benton had arranged it. Janine sat in the gallery in the second row. She had dressed carefully. She held her hands still in her lap. Dale was in the gallery. He had come as an observer, which was the only capacity available to him, and he had the expression of someone who was performing the role of observer while conducting a great deal of internal activity. Greta sat 3 seats from Dale, which was farther than their usual distance in public settings. Benton Shaw began. He presented the sealed document in its entirety. He presented the investigator's report and photographs. He presented the financial documentation of the transfers. He presented evidence of the subsidiary company and its beneficial ownership. Judge Waverly reviewed each item without expression. She asked 2 clarifying questions, both directed at Benton, both answered with precision. Then Benton said, "Your Honor, I have an audio recording to present as the evidence." He played it through the courtroom speakers. Greta's voice, clear and steady, providing context. Then Veronica's voice, the words, the small, dry laugh at the end. The courtroom was quiet when it finished. Judge Waverly wrote something in her notes. She looked briefly at the gallery and looked back at the table. Then Benton said, "Your Honor, I have one final document. A letter, handwritten by Clara Whitfield, addressed to the presiding judge of any guardianship hearing that might follow her death. She prepared it at the same time as the sealed document." He produced the letter. He confirmed its authentication. He asked permission to read it aloud. Judge Waverly said, "Proceed." Benton read. The courtroom was completely still. Clara had written without anger. This was the first thing anyone in that room understood when they heard the words. The complete absence of bitterness in the language, which was, in its own way, more powerful than bitterness would have been. Anger would have made it easy to qualify or dismiss. This had no anger to qualify. It had only clarity. She had written about her marriage with honesty and without cruelty. She had written about the choices she had made, including the choice to stay as long as she had, and the choice to prepare rather than to leave. She had written about Edmund as someone capable of better than he had managed, and she had said clearly that she was not asking the court to remove him from his children's lives. She was asking the court to ensure that his children's interests were protected by people other than Edmund Aman alone. She had named Janine Crawford. She had written about Janine as someone who had loved without condition and served without being asked, and who understood what Clara's children needed because she had always understood what Clara needed without being told. She had named Ruth Whitfield. She had written about Ruth with the careful, specific generosity of someone who had been hurt by a person and had decided to understand them anyway. She had written that Ruth was a woman who knew the difference between right and wrong and would act on it when it mattered, and that she believed these children would be the thing that made it matter to her. She had been right. Benton put the pages down. Judge Waverly removed her reading glasses. She cleaned them. She replaced them. She looked at the pages in front of her for a long moment. "I'd like to call Dr. Patricia Sorn," she said. Dr. Sorn had been waiting in the hall. She entered with the composed efficiency of someone who understood the weight of courtrooms and was not intimidated by it. She took the witness seat. She confirmed her credentials. She answered the factual questions about the birth in precise clinical language, the timing, the complications, the emergency nature of the procedure, the survival of both twins, the death of the mother at 5:53 in the afternoon. She answered without flinching. She had been preparing for this testimony for 3 weeks. She could deliver it now, with her voice steady and her face neutral and her hands still in her lap. Then Judge Waverly looked at her directly. "Dr. Sorn," she said, "in your professional medical assessment, are Oliver and Elise Whitfield the biological children of Edmund James Whitfield?" Dr. Sorn said, "Yes, Your Honor." She said it the way she said everything in this room, steadily, without drama, the voice of someone who deals in facts and has brought one here. DNA confirmation was completed as part of routine birth documentation at Mercy Summit Hospital, she continued. Both children are the biological offspring of Edmund James Whitfield. Their birth certificates have been filed accordingly with the state registrar. They are his legal heirs. The room was quiet. Edmund was looking at the table. In the gallery, Dale Whitfield said nothing. His hands rested on his knees. Greta, 3 seats away, watched his hands and noted that they were not quite steady. Veronica was not in the courtroom. She had not been permitted to attend as a non-represented, non-family party. She was in the penthouse, watching a news application on her phone. The updates came in fragments from a journalist she had cultivated. The update arrived at 11:43. Whitfield twins confirmed biological heirs in family court proceeding. She put her phone face down on the table. The crystal bowl that had held the white ranunculus had been washed and put away in a cabinet. The beeswax candle holders were in a drawer she had not opened in 2 weeks. She sat in the penthouse with the panoramic view of the city that had not changed, the towers and the grid of the streets and the distant glitter of other people's windows, and she was very, very quiet. The city did not look back. In the courtroom, Judge Waverly delivered her ruling. Shared guardianship between Edmund Whitfield and Ruth Whitfield with quarterly review. Janine Crawford, named as the children's designated advocate in any future legal proceedings. The financial transfers referred to the Civil Review Board for investigation. Clara's sealed document and her letter to the court entered into the permanent record. Judge Waverly looked at Edmund. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I have read your late wife's letter to this court. She did not ask me to punish you. She asked me to protect your children. I intend to do that. I would encourage you to ask yourself going forward whether the choices you make honor what she asked for." Edmund looked at the judge. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. It was all he said. After the hearing adjourned, Janine walked to the parking structure through the side exit. She had her coat collar turned up and her hands in her pockets. Her left hand found the 3 house keys she had been carrying since the hospital. Front door, garden gate, the third one, the cellar key that she had never gotten around to asking about. She turned them over in her fingers as she walked. Footsteps behind her in the parking structure. She turned. Benton Shaw, walking toward his car, briefcase under his arm. He stopped when he saw her. "She asked me to give you something," he said. After the hearing, if it went the way she hoped it would. He opened his briefcase. He took out a small envelope, her name on the front, in Clara's handwriting. Round letters, slightly tilted, leaning forward the way Clara's writing always had, as if the words were moving toward something. Janine took it with both hands. She held it for a moment. "She was very specific," Benton said. "After, only after." "I know," Janine said. "That was very her." She put the envelope in her coat pocket with the 3 keys. She drove home. The final ruling arrived on a Friday morning. A courier brought it in a manila envelope, no ceremony, the way important documents arrived in the real world, without the weight their contents deserved. Edmund signed for it in the foyer. He stood with the envelope in his hands for a moment before he opened it. He read it twice. Shared guardianship, Ruth in a formal supporting role, Janine as advocate, the financial investigation ongoing. The words on the page were exactly what Judge Waverly had said in the courtroom, made permanent, made official, made the new structure of things. He said it on the hall table. He went to the nursery. Oliver was awake and conducting his regular research into the ceiling. Elise was asleep on her side, with one fist curled under her chin. The sage-green walls. The 2 cribs. The rocking chair in the corner with the cream upholstery. The small blue ceramic pot on the window ledge. The plant healthy and green, tended every morning, by Addie, and then by Margaret, and now by Edmund himself, who had started doing it 3 days ago without planning to, who had simply been in the nursery one morning and noticed the soil was dry and gone to get water. It was the first thing he had done in this house that was purely domestic, purely quiet, purely for its own sake. He picked up Oliver and sat in the rocking chair. Oliver looked up at him with the focused, ancient gaze of newborns, who have not yet learned to look away from things that are looking at them. Edmund sat in the chair Clara had chosen and held his son, and the room was quiet around him, and he let the quiet be what it was. He was not forgiven. The story did not give him that. Forgiveness was not the story's to give. That would come, or not come, from places the story could not reach. What it gave him was this: a room his wife had built for these children before they arrived, a chair she had found and made into something with her own hands, a plant she had placed on the ledge because she had read that living things make a room feel loved, a direction, which was forward, which was the only direction available, a place to start. Ruth and Janine arranged to meet in the nursery the following afternoon. Ruth arrived first. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room. She had not been in it since the night she arrived at the estate after the court reading, when she had stood at the threshold and looked at the cribs and the rocking chair and the plant and said nothing for a long time. She went to Elise's crib and lifted her with the practiced steadiness of a woman who had held many small people over 71 years and understood that the holding itself was a form of statement. Elise made a small sound. Accommodation. Acceptance. Janine arrived a few minutes later. She came to Oliver's crib and lifted him, and he looked at her with his research gaze, cataloging her. The 2 women stood in the sage-green room. Ruth said, not looking at Janine, but at Elise's small face. She chose the right people. Janine said, she always chose right. She just didn't always choose herself first. Ruth turned this over. She examined it from several angles, the way you examine something when you want to understand it fully. We can teach them to choose themselves, she said. We will, Janine said. They stood in the room with no urgency and no agenda, and the afternoon light coming through the window, touching the plant on the ledge, making the sage-green walls warm. Outside, the sky was moving from afternoon into the particular blue-gray of early spring, the color that looks cold but carries warmth in it if you stay in it long enough. That evening, Janine sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she was actually going to drink. She took the small envelope from her coat pocket, where it had been since the parking structure outside the courthouse. Clara's handwriting on the front, round letters, slightly tilted, leaning forward. She opened it carefully, with both hands. The way you open something you understand is significant. The letter was one page and the beginning of a second. Clara's handwriting throughout, moving at different speeds in different sections, slower in some places, hurried in others, as if certain thoughts had required more time to form and others had arrived all at once. Janine read it from the beginning. The first sections were about the children, about what Clara hoped for them, about the specific ways she hoped Ruth and Janine would be present for them, complementary rather than competing, which she had put enough thought into to describe in some detail, about the things she wanted them to know when they were old enough to know them. Janine read these sections with her jaw tight and her eyes very clear. Then she reached the last section. She read it. She sat with it for a moment. She read it again, and then she laughed, a single sudden laugh, wet at the edges, the kind of laugh that comes when you have been given something you needed badly and were not expecting. The laugh of being seen completely and specifically by someone who had paid attention over many years and had saved this one last piece of attention for the end. The laugh of recognition, the laugh of love, the specific and irreplaceable variety that only a particular person can produce in you and that you will spend the rest of your life missing. She put the letter down. She picked it up. She read the last section one more time. What Clara had written in the final paragraphs of her letter was not about the estate, not about the twins, not about Edmund, not about the legal proceedings that had just concluded. Those things were handled. She had handled them in the sealed document, which was where they belonged. What Clara had written to Janine was about a plan made between two 20-year-olds in a small apartment in autumn, the second year of college, with a bottle of bad wine and a pot of very good pasta and the absolute, uncomplicated certainty of their own futures spread before them like a map they believed they could read. They had found a photograph in a travel magazine that someone had left in the common room of their dormitory. The west coast of Ireland, a cliff above the Atlantic, green and wind-worn and ancient, the kind of landscape that makes you feel the size of yourself against the world and find it somehow not diminishing, but clarifying. They had agreed, with the full seriousness of people who are being wonderfully silly and know it, that they would go there someday, together. They would stand on that cliff, and they would feel the wind, and they would look at the ocean. 20 years had passed. Life had complicated itself in the ways that lives always complicated themselves. The trip had remained in the category of someday. Someday had remained in the category of when things settle down. Things had not settled down. Janine, Clara had written, you have been telling me for 20 years that you are waiting for me to go to that cliff with you. You have been waiting so patiently and so loyally and so completely in the way that you do everything. I am telling you now, officially, from wherever I am when you read this. Stop waiting. Go stand on that cliff. Feel the wind. Look at the ocean. It is enormous, and it has been there for a very long time before either of us, and it will be there for a very long time after, and standing in front of it will remind you of the accurate size of both the problems and the possibilities. When you are standing there, tell me what it looks like. Describe it out loud, to the air, to the wind. I will hear you. You know I will. I always heard you when it mattered. You always made yourself heard when it mattered to me. Go, Janine. The cliff is not going anywhere, but you have been waiting long enough. Janine folded the letter. She held it in both hands for a moment. She set it on the table beside her tea. She opened her laptop. She typed, "Flights, Dublin, Ireland." She typed, "West Coast, Ireland, Atlantic Cliffs." She typed, "Cliffs of Moher, visiting." The photographs appeared on her screen, green and enormous and ancient. The wind visible in every photograph, in the bent grasses, and the movement of the sea below. The Atlantic gray and silver and infinite, going all the way to the edge of everything. She looked at them for a long time. She thought about Clara at 7 months pregnant, taking the train downtown alone, walking 4 blocks to a lawyer's office with a sealed envelope and a precise list of instructions, and the composure of someone who had decided that love is not passive, that love is a verb, that the highest form of love is the preparation you make for the people you will not always be there to protect. She thought about Oliver with his research gaze, Elise with her fist curled under her chin. She thought about Ruth in George's reading chair, learning at 71 that it was not too late to begin. She thought about Addie Carr, walking beside the hospital bed down the corridor because Clara should not have to go alone. She thought about Greta, speaking clearly into a phone, taking up the space she had been given and deciding it was not enough, that it had never been enough, that she was done pretending it was. She thought about Clara. The way you think about people who have changed the shape of your life permanently and quietly, the way weather shapes rock, slow and total and without needing to announce itself. Somewhere, in a house not unlike the one in this story, a woman is lying awake. It is 3 in the morning. The room is dark. She is holding her phone above her face and looking at the screen, at the call log, at the messages that do not say what she needs them to say. She is checking it the way you check things when you already know the answer and are hoping the knowing will change if you check one more time. Lock, unlock, lock, lock. She knows. She has known for longer than she has admitted. She has known in the way Clara knew, not all at once, not in a single revelation, but in the accumulation of small moments. The dinner that ended before it began, the call that went unanswered, the question she stopped asking because she already knew the answer, and the answer was too heavy to hold. She knows what needs to happen. The question is not whether she knows. The question is whether she is ready to put the phone face down and not pick it up again. Whether she is ready to stop waiting for the call that is not coming and start moving toward whatever is waiting for her instead. Clara Whitfield made that choice. She made it at 37 weeks in a cold surgical suite with a doctor she trusted and her best friend's hand and the small white freesia someone had remembered to put in the window because a small kindness is still a kindness and always will be. She made it with everything she had, in the time she had, for the people she loved most. That was the inheritance, not the estate, not the documents or the court rulings or the legal protections she had so carefully arranged, though those mattered enormously. The deeper inheritance was this: the knowledge that love is preparation, that building something for the people who come after you is not a consolation prize for not being there yourself. It is the most enduring thing you can do, the thing that remains when everything else has shifted. Clara had seen clearly. She had acted on what she saw. She had built something that outlasted her, and it was holding, and it would keep holding. Janine Crawford booked her flight to Ireland on a Thursday evening in early April. She chose a window seat. She packed Clara's letter in the interior pocket of her carry-on, the one closest to her chest. She landed in Dublin on a Friday morning when the sky was the particular soft gray of Irish spring, not the gray of absence, but the gray of something gathered and waiting. She took a train and then a bus, and then walked the last half-mile along a path that smelled of rain and grass, and the sea coming up from below. She stood on the cliff 11 days after the court hearing. The Atlantic was below, enormous and silver and ancient, and completely indifferent to the size of any single human grief or joy, which was, she understood immediately, exactly what Clara had intended her to feel. The wind came up the cliff face with the force of something that had been traveling a very long distance and had not slowed down for anything. She stood there. She felt the wind. She looked at the ocean. She described it out loud, to the air, to the wind, to whatever was listening. She said, "Clara, it is enormous. It is the most enormous thing I have ever seen. The grass is very green, and the wind is very cold, and there is nothing between here and the horizon goes on forever." She said, "You were right. This is the right size. This is exactly the right size for everything." She stood there for a long time, back in the sage-green nursery of the Whitfield estate. Oliver and Elise slept in their side-by-side cribs in the late morning light. The small blue ceramic pot on the window ledge caught the sun and leaned toward it, the way plants do, the way all living things do, turning toward whatever warmth is available, seeking it without apology, growing toward it with the simple, total commitment of things that know what they need and move toward it without reservation. Someone had remembered to water it. Someone always would. Closing disclaimer: this content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team with the intention of bringing meaningful stories and lasting lessons to every person who listens. All characters and events are fictional and created for storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or real events is entirely coincidental. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. It means everything.